Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Executive, a place where entrepreneurs, investors, and operators share their life lessons and advice on how to make it at the highest level. Today, we are joined by Robert Jack, the CEO of Sparrow Pharmaceuticals. Robert, so good to have you here today.
Matt, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Robert, your team is doing a lot of really interesting work. Excited to dig in on what your team is doing, where you're at with clinical trials. But maybe let's start there. What is Sparrow Pharmaceuticals, and what's your team up to?
So thanks for the opportunity. We're a pretty typical private drug development focused biotech, which is a private company means that we raise a certain amount of money and we have a certain business plan, and we just flat out have to execute because when that money's gone, that money's gone.
Yeah.
And so we're a small team. We only have 8 full-time employees, but we have a very ambitious plan. We're actually conducting 3 simultaneous phase 2 clinical trials with our lead drug, and at the same time preparing the company for when we have that data, obviously, to be ready for next steps.
And it's interesting you mentioned that you're a small team, because I noticed that it seems like you guys have been really lean to get to where you're at. I want to talk about that a little bit. How have you guys stayed so lean to get to phase 2 trials?
Yeah, this is the way I've run a number of different companies. I mean, we only hire highly experienced people. What I tell people is we don't hire people to do what we ask them to do. We hire people to tell us what to do. And so when you
That's
come to
good.
work for a company like Sparrow, and we're not unique in this regard, you're coming in with a certain expertise that we need, and you already know what needs to be done.
Right.
So beyond a core of highly experienced people, we like to not build a lot of kind of permanent infrastructure. And so we make use of a lot of consultants, a lot of contractors, a lot of vendors to outsource a lot of our actual execution work.
And obviously part of that is just cash preservation, because you only have so much capital like any company. But is also part of that is you go into clinical trials, you don't know what's going to work, right? And so you just need to be able to pivot, and with less people, you're able to do that quicker. Is that part of it?
Well, certainly we have to be flexible. We're certainly built for success. I think it's really just more a matter of not building that overhead infrastructure so you have
Yeah.
that permanent cost infrastructure. I just think we don't need gleaming glass office towers, right? We need patients on drugs showing that we can have a good medical impact.
Right. And then you joined the team not that long ago. Was it last year, or was this 2021?
I've been with the company just a little over 2 years now, right? So the
Okay.
very beginning of 2021.
Is that right? You joined when the team raised a $50 million Series A from, I think, led by OrbiMed. Can you talk a little bit
Right.
about that, how that all worked out? I know you were an entrepreneur in residence at one point with OrbiMed. How did that all come to fruition, where it made sense for you to join as CEO at that time?
Yeah. So the way I got here, and then also how the company got here, I had been a part of a previous company backed by OrbiMed called Therapeutics. We sold that company in 2017. It was after that I joined OrbiMed for a few months as an entrepreneur in residence, and I can talk about that experience. I actually got a call from someone with a different firm who was also invested in Symbiomics and asking me to take a look at a company called Therapeutics, which I ended up taking over in late 2018, which is a great little company, also backed by terrific investors, Atlas and F Prime. Unfortunately, that drug failed. This happens in our industry in mid 2020, and that's when I got a call from another person who'd been on the board of Symbiomics, who's associated with OrbiMed, and asked me if I'd take a look at Sparrow with them in the fall of 2020. And I did help them do some diligence, help them fill out the syndicate of the investors, and joined that company in the beginning of 2021. So one of the things I like to do is work with really great investors. That's really important in this industry. And so when I get a call from folks at F Prime or folks at OrbiMed, I'm very excited to at least take a look at what they have.
And how did it turn into you becoming the CEO? Was that always in mind when they made that call for you to take a look at it, or was it just very obvious that your skill sets were perfect for this?
Yeah, well, that's why they called me. Is
Yeah.
they had a really great scientific officer associated with Sparrow, and we're looking for someone to fill the CEO role to complement those skills. And so knew that my previous company, unfortunately, was not going to make it. And so that's why I got that phone call is potentially be the CEO of Sparrow.
And you had that relationship from being an entrepreneur in residence. Can you talk a little bit about what that entails and what is an entrepreneur in residence?
Yeah, it means different things at different firms. These investment firms are all very different from each other, driven by the personalities of the partners. And so at OrbiMed, it is a specifically defined role for an individual that comes in. So for my role, it was to look for potential assets to start a new company similar to Symbiomics,
Yeah.
similar to the business plan for Symbiomics, which had been a drug that was approved outside the United States, but had never been brought to the United States. And there was a novel indication that there's some evidence it worked for. And so I was brought in to spend a few months trying to find a very similar asset to that. Other firms, it might mean something very different. There are some firms that have entrepreneurs in residence that I think are there with less of a specific mandate, that they help
Right.
look at opportunities and provide guidance and maybe sit on boards and maybe join a company, et cetera.
And they're kind of getting trained at that same point, right?
Yeah, so at OrbiMed, it just was something, that's just what
Yeah.
it means differently at OrbiMed. But for me, it was a fascinating experience to be able to kind of go to the other side. I'd never been
Yeah.
in a financial institution. I'd always been on the operation side. And so to be able to be part of all the partner meetings, be a part of all of the presentations from other companies, hear the discussion, I just think gave me a very different perspective, and one that's extremely helpful now in working with investors and the board, which is a big part of my job. Instead of kind of being mystified by
Yeah.
what goes on behind the curtain,
Right.
that's been helpful.
And what are some of those, mysteries that you learned that is now super helpful as a CEO?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Trying to think of very specific things, and I'm not sure I'm going to come up with something on the spot. I think more just understanding the priorities, and maybe also understanding the kind of the attention. I don't want to say attention span, but one thing I say, it's a similar thing where people at small companies don't understand big pharma companies and vice versa. And I've had the
Right.
good fortune of working, at Pfizer, one of the largest, and then some of the smallest. And what I say about big pharma is that they'll wear one hat for 1,000 projects, and we're wearing 1,000 hats for one project, and it's just a very different perspective. And so you can get frustrated. Why aren't they paying attention to me? Which is obviously the most important thing in the world. But that's
Right.
not, understanding that what someone's life is like working in a big pharma company just helps. And I think the same thing is just understanding what the priorities are and what the life is like working in investment firms helps when speaking to investors.
Right. Raising the next round, that you're kind of constantly always raising capital, right? As an early stage CEO.
Right. Yeah. Really focused on, what you have this capital, what are you going to do with it? And, what value are you going to create? And then, so how are we going to create capital, from that towards the next stage? And I think always kind of thinking about looking forward. I mean, it's easy in a company like this to get bogged down in some of the details of the operation. And fortunately, I have a great team that does that day to day. And so I really try to step back and spend more time thinking about, okay, but what's next, right?
Yeah.
And where are we going next? And how are we going to be prepared to be implementing that next step after this? And what about the step after that? And what are the different scenarios that we could see ourselves in the next 12, 24, 36 months? And so at those different forks in the road, are we prepared to go down those different paths? So I think working with really good investors and understanding their perspective has helped me to see that and focus on that more, versus just, if I generate great data, everything will take care of itself, right? Which is not the case.
It's not enough.
Yeah, exactly.
And you probably learned too how to really leverage your investors, right? Really lean into them. Where I think sometimes as an entrepreneur, raise capital, those become sometimes your bosses, right? And so you almost maybe are a little afraid of how much information do I share. And I'm sure you've learned, how to navigate that and use them more than just capital. Is that a right assumption?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said at the beginning, I think working with high quality investors is at the top of my list when I'm trying to evaluate an opportunity. And I've been fortunate to be able to have some choices and work with great investors. But why is it great to work with great investors? Well, several reasons. One, they have a reputation, and so that just opens a lot of doors. If people know OrbiMed's your lead investor, then they
Yeah.
know it's high quality science. They know there's high quality people behind it, and so that just makes it much easier going forward to, for instance, raise additional capital. But then, in addition, I think the people you work with, are going to be highly knowledgeable, very expert, successful investors. And so drawing on that knowledge base, and I'll say it's on our website, so folks know who's on our board, but, Peter Thompson is the
Right.
investment partner on our board from OrbiMed, and one of the most successful investors, I don't know, the past, decade or more, and having worked with hundreds of companies. And there's just so much knowledge and there that whenever I talk to him, I think he helps me to, as I was kind of saying before, focus on, well, okay, but this is maybe what's coming down the pipe. And so I'd like you to be thinking about this and helping prepare the company. So I just think that experience is so invaluable. And then just as I mentioned, that, the quality of the people, the Klaus Weitinger, again, is on our website, so I'm not saying anything confidential.
Yeah.
Is just, so experienced and just such a really terrific guy. Somebody I jumped at the chance to work with again. There are investors out there, the expression I heard, that there's some investors that they're paid to shoot the dog and sell the doghouse,
Right.
which is not the kind of investor that you want to work with. You want to work with an investor that really sees the value in management and wants to partner with management for the best outcomes. And so I think that's some of the things that are valuable to me in working with OrbiMed and the other folks in our company. I don't want to shortchange Rivervest and USVP,
Right.
either, terrific groups.
And you had the fortune of knowing some of these people coming in as you were helping them look at the company itself. But as other entrepreneurs that are trying to find the investors that can truly add value, what would you say to that? I mean, how do you decipher someone who is just purely a check versus I could really lean on this person when things are tough or good, just to learn from them and help us navigate the company?
Yeah, look, the truth is sometimes when you're raising money, you'll take money from anywhere. And so, it's a
Yeah.
luxury if you can choose your investors. When I was raising money for Symbiomics, we would have, we were getting to the point where we had cup, shaking a cup on the corner.
Right.
But if you have the opportunity, I think reputations precede people. This is a very small
Yeah.
industry, and all you really have is your reputation. And so you talk to people. It's not that difficult to start to figure out the different types of folks out there and some of the war stories people have. And I've been in some kind of ugly situations as well. But, so I think that's, certainly I'd say talk to other people that have been in this industry, and off the record, they'll tell you,
Yeah.
they'll tell you a lot.
We'll
But,
save you a lot of
what
heartache in the future.
yeah, absolutely. So if you have the opportunity to choose your investors, there's some folks that I won't name them, that I would at this point in my career just decline to work with. And so I think that if you ask around, you'll figure out who those
Yeah.
folks are.
And you've mentioned, your former company quite a few different times. I'm sure you've learned quite a few lessons from that. Are there any lessons that really stick out to you from that experience that you're really trying to take into Sparrow, of maybe things not to do or things you did right that still didn't work? What are some of the lessons that you're taking in from that last experience?
Yeah. So that was you're talking about Indolo Therapeutics, which
Yeah.
unfortunately didn't make it. So some of the things that you may not sort of see about that company, but we had a really interesting team dynamic, and not always positive. And I think that's something that I learned a tremendous amount from at that company, and then bringing that forward and understanding how important it is to have a good culture, a good team dynamic, especially in a company like ours that's, I don't like the term virtual, but geographically distributed.
Right.
We're all across the country. We actually have more states represented than employees because we have some snowbirds. But it really does make a difference that
Yeah.
if the interpersonal side breaks down, it does impact the ability of the company to function. And that's not what led to Undilo, unfortunately, not making it, but could have
Yeah.
if things had gone a different direction. So I think that's something I've really tried to focus on here at Sparrow, is bringing in people that I think will contribute to the right culture, trying to build on that culture. Not always. Look, we've had we've stubbed our toes a couple of times there as well, but
Right.
because we're human beings and people are complicated but I think when we've stubbed our toe, I've really tried to um, make it a priority to focus on that and get us back on course. And I think the team appreciates that. I think they see that that's something that even though we haven't always been perfect, that it is a priority of mine. And it's a place where we care about the people here and we want it to
Yeah.
be a place where people want to work and where they're comfortable working and they're motivated. And so we don't always succeed at that 100%, but it is important.
And what is the, culture is a pretty vague word. What's the culture you're going after that you're really hiring for and looking for in people?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, we can, I mean, let me just start one sentence, stop and start another. But we spent a little time focusing on what are our corporate values on our
Yeah.
website. And I don't have a mission statement, although we talk about our purpose, which I guess is the same thing. But um, we actually the values do matter, and it starts with respect. And so, to me, that means respect for each individual, but respect for people's perspectives. And so, one thing that's been toxic to me is like a siloed work culture and kind of a
Yeah.
supreme arrogance. And I have this title or degree, and so I'm not I'm not interested in listening to you, or you don't sit at the table, or I'm not going to share information. That's I think that's very, very toxic. Um, things like we say tenacity and just in this industry, you're going to run into to hurdles. You're going to run into near death experiences, and you just got to figure out a way to push on through and get there. And um, I'm looking for people I think that are self motivated because, as I said, we're very small and there's no place to hide in a
Right.
company like this, which is an expression I like.
8 or so people.
Yeah, it's pretty clear if someone's pulling their weight or not, and
Yeah.
we need people who thrive in that environment, right? Who are self motivated um, and care about what we're trying to do, and so I think we try to have fun, but we're looking for people that are really dedicated, committed to executing on our on our business plan and getting this drug and seeing if it can really help patients. So I don't know if that helps or not, but that's what we're trying to foster.
Yeah, definitely. And you talked about the mission of Sparrow. What is the mission? What's the vision, of Sparrow? Where are you trying to where's the company trying to go?
Yeah, so we're developing one drug, although we're taking it in several different directions, based upon a bit of biology that we think has been underappreciated, and that is the biology of how steroids, or is a kind of common name, but glucocorticoids are metabolized inside of cells. And so we have a mechanism called HSD1, a drug called SBI62, which we licensed from a big pharma company. Um, so, this mechanism was tried for several different diseases and worked okay, but not that great. But we think it's as we said, think underappreciated in this way. So, people think of one of the primary steroids your body creates is cortisol, very
Yeah.
potent substance, does a lot of things in your body. Um, it's considered part of the endocrine system, kind of one of the core functions of the endocrine system is the HPA axis that adrenal glands secrete cortisol and has these functions. So an endocrine effector is defined as one that's secreted by one part of the body. It travels to the bloodstream and has to affect somewhere else. That's kind of the definition. Well, what we're showing through our mechanism is actually cortisol is largely what's called an autocrine effector, which is that it's activated inside the cell where it has its activity, which is really turns the field on its head because people think about it, completely differently. As I said, it's kind of a core part of the endocrine system, not the autocrine
Yeah.
system. And so we've been able to demonstrate that by inhibiting HSD1, you can lower cortisol levels inside of cells. And by doing so, you can reduce the activity, or in our case, the toxicity of cortisol without affecting the overall levels of cortisol in the bloodstream, which again, kind of makes people scratch their head. They wouldn't have thought that was possible because it's an
Yeah.
endocrine effector. So what we're doing with that is we're applying that to a couple different spaces where we believe the toxicity of steroids or cortisol is the primary causal factor of the disease. An obvious place to go with that is Cushing syndrome, which is a condition where people have a tumor that either directly or indirectly causes their body to secrete way too much cortisol, and it's a devastating disease. There are some treatments, but they tend to be toxic or not as effective as they need to be. And so being able to come into this space with a completely new mechanism, looking at this biology completely differently, and potentially with a new mode of treatment for these patients is very exciting. The other side, where we're using this concept, was in steroid drugs like prednisone, which is some of the most widely used drugs in the world.
Right. Yeah.
Everybody has stories of people they know that are on prednisone. And yet these drugs are incredibly toxic. So a large percentage of all the adverse events reported on drugs are just due to steroids, and with their long-term use is a very predictable set of problems. People develop diabetes, bone fractures, hyperlipidemia, hypertension, mood memory problems, thin skin. You could go on and on.
Major side effects. Yeah.
And so similarly how cortisol is metabolized, these drugs like prednisone are cortisol analogs. And so prednisone actually is a prodrug that's activated inside of cells to a drug called prednisolone, which outside the United States is also widely used on its own. And so inhibition of HSD1, we believe, can lower active prednisolone levels inside of cells, where causing toxicity when people take prednisone or prednisolone. And so our hope is that we can actually develop a drug that has the same efficacy as, say, prednisone, but with fewer side effects. So that's kind of a quick rundown on kind of our scientific approach and how we're applying it with our one drug.
And you were talking a little bit about where you are today in clinical two trials, phase 2 trials. Where are you as like the CEO when you have a finite amount of resources? How do you decide where to allocate capital resources, like at this stage of the company? Where's the focus?
Yeah. So, I mean, the business plan that we had going in with our Series A was to run 3 phase 2 trials, basically in 3 years, to test these 2 different hypotheses, but in 3 different indications. And so, in my mind, I'm continuously thinking, okay, how do we execute on that and get to where we need to get to, and then have the company prepared to react and act on that data, as I was saying before. And so I think it's a constant conversation of, is that going to help us create value to get to the next step? And if it's not, unfortunately, it may need to be deprioritized. And so I think that's just a constant question, because there's a million things we could do. People have ideas, let's do this. This would be really exciting scientifically. Why don't we take a look at this? Yeah. And I think there just has to be a continuous process of kind of focus and prioritizing and saying, is that going to help us achieve our goal, which is to generate data showing that this drug can treat these diseases, and have the company be in a position to act on that and go forward. And if not, then we don't do it.
That's probably pretty hard too, as the CEO, as maybe someone on your team comes to you with another idea, right, of where this could go, and you have to be really methodical about, is that where our focus should be, knowing you only have so many resources. Probably hard to say no, right, when you're also supposed to be the visionary.
So, the way I approach that is, first of all, I engage the team in helping to define what it is we're trying to accomplish and how we're going to accomplish it. What I don't just proclaim on high what are kind of our purposes and our goals are. Obviously, we know you have a starting point of, this is what we were hired to do, this is the money we have, and this is what we've been tasked to do with it. But beyond that, I want to engage the team in what's important and what do we need to accomplish. And that way, those conversations actually aren't that difficult. Because if everybody understands what we're trying to do and why, and what the focus is, and what our goals are, and what it's going to take to achieve that, then when people bring up ideas, I can say, that's great, but is that going to help us get what we really need to get to in the next 12 months?
And they're honest about it.
Yeah, and people say, I can see that. Maybe that needs to to be pushed off to the next stage. And so I think that that's kind of what I want to foster in a company. Is I try to be very transparent with people about kind of those strategic goals and what we're trying to accomplish. And I think that's wise, so that people understand what we're doing, and they understand how what they're doing fits in, but also what they don't need to be doing. And I think a big part of frustration for some people is if they can be working on something and then they don't know why they're doing it, or they can feel like it doesn't make any difference that they're doing it, that's very demotivating. And
Yeah.
so, what I say is, well, if you're doing something you don't need to be doing it, stop doing it, because we don't have
We
that
don't
many
have time
people.
for that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, many myths, right, about running a company, but maybe you can demystify a few of them. At an earlier stage company, you wear a lot of different hats. I don't know if there's such a thing as an average day for you, but what does kind of your day typically look like? Where do you, focus yourself rather than, necessarily focus the team? And how do you kind of keep track of things that are important for you?
Yeah, so what I'd like to do is kind of set the strategy, have everyone understand it, have everyone buy in, and then have them execute. And I can spend my time talking to potential new investors, talking to potential strategic partners out there trying to kind of build towards that next step. That works to some degree because I've got a highly experienced team. But then, things come up and
Yeah.
you get pulled back in, and so having to deal with some operational issue, having to make a decision about something, having to deal with personnel issues. Um, so I think it's the pull between that kind of day to day operational oversight,
Yeah.
um, which is necessary. Even though you have highly experienced people kind of it has to be somebody with their hand on the tiller, or else the
Yeah.
boat will run ashore,
Right.
even if you have great sailors.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so there should be somebody kind of saying, okay, we're gonna go this direction. But then trying to focus more on that bigger picture and preparing for the next steps.
So you really have to balance the two, right? Where you're looking into the future of, I got to talk to future investors constantly, but at the same time, I need to keep one hand on the wheel operationally and never be
Yeah,
too much on either
absolutely.
side.
Absolutely. Like I said, I have a fantastic team, but the best ship needs someone at
Yeah.
in the rudder. So yeah, you have to balance those two things, and don't always get it right. So I try not to sit on every call, every meeting, because just like the quantum physics, observation actually changes the underlying process, and so
Right.
uh,
Right.
so when I'm
Yeah.
on every call, people are like, oh, the CEO's on the call. Well, that's not helpful. They need to be able to do their
Yeah.
work, and but at the same time, if I don't know what's going on, then things can go down a different direction that maybe I don't want them going down. So I try and
Yeah.
balance that as well.
Yeah. Tough balance. Speaking of habits, are there any habits that you've really instilled in your life that have been incredibly impactful for you?
Well, I think I don't like the term balance because you have to be kind of willing to be imbalanced and give it all to a company like this when necessary. But I do try and maintain some priorities, and I really try to get to the gym, get my exercise in, because
Yeah.
otherwise I'm gonna fall apart. I've got a couple of daughters and my wife, and that's the most important thing in my life.
Yeah.
Comes way ahead of work, and so I think just making sure to um, continue to give those things priority, I think is really important. And then beyond that, this is not a. I tell people who join Sparrow or that this is not a 9 to 5 job. That's not what we're here for. I believe their family and these individuals come first, but then beyond that, they need to be totally committed to the success of the company. And I think it's important for people to feel ownership.
Yeah.
To have, it's one of the reasons also to be a part of generating what is our purpose, what are we trying to do here, what's our objective, having people have a stake, an equity stake, and feel like this is their company.
Yeah.
This is not somebody else's company they work for. This is their company. And so I guess, I try and balance those things where it sounds a bit paradoxical, but, yes, while kind of we're individuals and family comes first, but this is, you have to be fully committed to success here.
Yeah. And it's a good point too of people that feel ownership are willing to go above and beyond, what a 9 to 5 may be where there's no ownership.
Absolutely. And willing to use creativity, right?
Yeah.
Instead of saying, well, whatever, it's somebody else's problem,
Right.
but how are we
That's
going
not
to
my
solve this
job.
problem? It's not my job, which is incidentally, we didn't talk about it, but when I was leaving Big Pharma, one of the things that convinced me to leave Big Pharma is I kept being told, don't do that. That's not your job.
Yeah.
Basically there's a whole department for that, and you're threatening their
Right.
livelihood.
You're threatening their jobs. Yeah.
Yeah. If I start to look into well, how should this product be priced in the marketplace? They're like, no, we have a pricing department. Don't do that. So
Right.
like that's just frustrating. And so you come to a company like Sparrow, and if you say, hey, I think we should be looking into kind of competitive pricing, and someone's like, great, do that. Go,
Yeah.
go,
Yeah. Yeah. Just shoot. Don't even aim.
Yeah,
Just shoot.
go,
Yeah.
great. And sometimes it's scary for people. They're like, wait, I just raised an idea, and now we're going a whole different direction.
Right.
Yeah, it was a good idea. We're going that way. So,
Right.
making
Be careful
decisions
what you
quickly.
raise.
And we're the ones making the decisions, which is really exciting and fun, right? So we get to sit around, and there's a group of us on my kind of senior team, although it's such a small company. I mean, everybody's involved
Everyone's
in
senior.
conversations. But, we're deciding what should we do, what's important, where do we go? And obviously we have a board, we have investors we answer to, and we have to meet those objectives. But, one of the things I learned about, I think, seeing the inside of an investment firm, and they're working with a lot of different companies, and they just physically can't be as involved, in day to day and understand what we're doing, and they have to depend on management. To be making a lot of decisions because they just don't have the information. And
we're at a small company. Everybody they know what's going on. There's a lot more information sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so that's a fun place to be, is to know that this is our little company. It's a real company with a drug that could be hugely impactful, and it belongs to us, this small group, and we're in charge of what happens to it. And that's a fun place to be.
Yeah, very much so. Throughout your career, has there been, maybe one book that to you has been super helpful in guiding you, or a resource that you'd like to point out?
Yeah, there's, I'll go back. Actually, I'm not sure if it's, I think a lot of things I read and learn help impact my, management and leadership and running a company, but maybe not as directly, not like a book on how to manage a biotech company. But,
right.
One book I love, I like books that give me new ways of thinking, new perspectives on things. And so Stephen Johnson's Where New Ideas Come From, I really loved. Did you read that one?
I haven't, no. I've just
you gotta pick. Yeah, it's a pretty easy read. I mean, it's kind of where does innovation come from? Do you need like lava lamps and like ping pong tables, and is that what leads to like innovation?
Yeah,
and he's
long
like,
walks
no,
on the
that's
beach.
not what leads to innovation. He's like, what leads to innovation is when people from different fields or disciplines run into each other, and the kind of most new ideas are kind of melding of aspects of two different fields that already exist. And I just kind of understanding that and seeing it, I thought was fascinating, because now that's kind of a part of how I like to run things. I was talking about, I don't like silos, right? I want people mixing. And then, a bit different, but I like to read Thomas Sowell as well. If you're familiar with Thomas Sowell, but kind of a philosophy, economics type of academic out of Stanford, but just has different perspectives on the world that I find very enlightening.
And on that reading topic, how big of a part of your week is that? Are you able to find time to dig into a book that you have a shelf of books, right, that you need to read? Like, how important is that for what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm one of those that I'm halfway through about 5 different books in any given time, kind of read it, put it down.
Many of us.
And sometimes I give up because I think a lot of books could actually be magazine articles, but you can't really sell those. And so they write books. But once I get the idea, sometimes I move on. But it is important to me. And, my job, some days it's, I'm not jammed all day long, right? Because I've got a great team. Other days, other things come up where it's, nonstop for, 24 hours a day over the weekend. And that's just kind of the nature of my job. So, yeah, a lot of times I can get home at a reasonable time and, and read a book in the evening.
Yeah. And as we wrap up, is there any advice that you'd leave for other CEOs, or maybe is advice that you've heard throughout your career that you really loved, or you've seen from other leaders that you'd like to share as we wrap up?
Well, I think it's a cliche, but it's true that all you have really is your reputation at the end of the day. And our industry is so small. I'm in the kind of private biotech world, which bridges over into the public biotech world, but still, kind of the biotech world is very small.
Yeah.
And I was talking about different investors and folks you will or not work with, but that's if you lose your reputation, you won't even know it, but you're done, right? Because people won't hire you, people won't work with you, and you're going to be done. So I think focusing on that, how you treat people,
Yeah.
treat people badly, and people be like, I don't want to work with that guy, or that
Right.
gal. And so focus on people, the people that work for you. If an old cliche that no one cares what you know until they know that you care, but that's really
Yeah.
true, right?
Right.
So I think focus on your people, and they'll reward that in kind. Focus on being honest and working with integrity, and opportunities will continue to come your way. I guess it's not rocket science what I'm saying, but it is very true, particularly in a
Yeah.
very small industry like ours.
Well, I mean, you said it earlier too, for how much it means internally, but also externally, right? People, you make calls when you're trying to find out more about an investor or, potential candidate. Small world, all those reputations are out there.
Absolutely, yeah. And people, off the record, they'll tell you, or they'll
Yeah.
decline to say good things, which is sometimes
Right.
the same thing. So that really is important, and so that's what I would say.
Yeah. If it's not a raving review on a reference, might be concerning.
Exactly.
Well, Robert, really appreciate you taking the time. Excited to see what you guys build with Sparrow, and just appreciate you being on.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking the time.